I'm going to tell you a little bit about Kevin. He is the development and operations lead for the Web Accessibility Initiative at the W3C. He was the head of digital accessibility and user research in the Scottish government. And he's here today to talk about organizational accessibility policy. Kevin, if you want to share your screen, take it away.
Thank you. If I can share my screen, it'll get rid of me looking at me, which is always a bad thing. 2 seconds.
Oh, and I forgot to add, everybody, if you'd like to ask questions, Kevin's happy to answer them throughout the presentation. Please enter your questions in the Q&A option on the bottom toolbar, and we'll be able to see those questions and screen them and all that. Thank you.
Yep, thank you very much, Anna. Very pleased to be here. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I mean, just to reiterate, I am happy to take questions as we go along, happy to keep it kind of relaxed and informal. I'm good with that. So if there's anything that's kind of jumps into your head when I say something, please do feel free to kind of put it in the Q&A, and I'll see if I can answer it as we go along. So yes, Sharon asked if I fancied chatting about digital accessibility policies and statements, and this is all part of their Be a Digital Ally, which is a free monthly series that covers basic skills and principles of accessible digital design, meant for people who work regularly and interact with and create digital content but are new to accessibility. So just to reiterate a little bit about me, I'm back working with the Web Accessibility Initiative in W3C. I was there about 8-9 years ago for a couple of years, and then had a 6 or 7 year stint in the Scottish government, heading up a variety of different bits and bobs around about user-centered design, digital accessibility, and so forth. Prior to that, I've done development jobs and other bits and bobs. There's a photo of me. I'm a late middle-aged white male with short grey hair and earrings. Cool. Just go on. So a quick note on language, and apologies in advance. I use disabled people and people with disabilities kind of interchangeably. In the UK, disabled people's a more common phrase. In the US, I know that people with disabilities is a more common phrase. Having kind of looked into this and spoken with some people about it, it's interesting that the social model of disability is used in both cases to say that the other form is incorrect. So I'm never quite sure which form is correct, and I end up bouncing back and forward between the two. So apologies if that's not what you would prefer. I'm trying to train myself to different localities. Starting out. So this is the starting out on kind of digital accessibility policy. And I think I wanted to put this here just because this isn't something that's kind of just a standalone, isolated piece that you will do. This is something that you really, really, really need allies for. A lot of the work that we do requires allies to support what we're doing, to persuade people to do things, to encourage change, whatever it happens to be. Writing of policies falls slap bang in the middle of that as well. Having allies throughout your organization will massively help when you're trying to deliver against your policy, because it won't just be a sort of a small lone voice in a massive organization trying to affect change. You will hopefully have a group of people around you and throughout the organization who are willing to step up and say that this is important, to prioritize it, to give it the appropriate resources, whatever it happens to be. The other thing I wanted to say, just kind of on the starting out piece, is a lot of this depends on your context. So I'm kind of going to go through a variety of things and I'm going to talk about them. This isn't a one size fits all. It's something that kind of, you'll need to kind of look at where you are, what you are doing, what your organization does, how it's structured, all of those sorts of things, and then start to think about the ideas and the principles that are behind an accessibility policy and look at how you're going to deliver against that. So bear that in mind when I'm talking through this. You may go, hang on a second, that's never going to work where I am. And that's fine. That's not what it's meant for, I don't think. I think it's more about the principles and ideas behind it rather than the specific steps that you're going to take. So possibly going to ask a daft question. I ask this a lot in my presentations because a lot of what we talk about now is within the framework of inclusion, and there's an intersectionality and overlap with other inclusion issues, which is an important thing to recognize and acknowledge. But I think the other thing that's important to be aware of is that that intersectionality sometimes, when you are looking at accessibility, when you're looking at the needs of disabled people, the barriers that poor accessibility brings will actually actively exclude people, and that can be really problematic. So when I talk about accessibility, I very much try and talk about the needs are specifically related to the needs of and regulation for people with disabilities. So I recognize that there are other things, and I'm going to touch on that in a wee bit as well. So, and again, possibly another stupid question, but what's a policy? And I think I'm just resorting to the dictionary for this one because it was there. And it's a course or principle of action adopted or proposed by an organization or individual. And I think the kind of summarizing that for me is very much it's about setting out your organizational intent. So this is what we are trying to do. Now there's aspects of it which may show your history depending on how old your policy is and how much work you've been putting into it over the years, but largely it's about that sense of, well, this is where we want to be and want to go, and maybe to a certain extent this is how we're going to do it. So that's what you're trying to capture within your policy and communicate that. So the title of the talk is kind of accessibility policies and statements. And there's almost a bit of well, just to describe what I'm talking about when I'm talking about an accessibility statement. Within UK and European legislation, there is a requirement that all public sector websites should provide an accessibility statement. It goes a wee bit beyond that, but they should provide an accessibility statement. And that statement there's a specified format to it, there's specified content that needs to be in there. It's all very kind of laid down in the legislation. Or at least the policymakers have taken it that it's laid down in the legislation, and that's exactly what you've got to deliver against. So that's fine. There is a massive overlap with accessibility policy because there's aspects within that accessibility statement, particularly the format, which are sort of similar to the sorts of things that you would put in a policy. But the difference that I kind of see, or I'm trying to sort of set them up as, is that your policy is aiming to capture your intent for your organization. And the statement's trying to capture and communicate the reality, where you are, what you've done, etc., etc. You may have kind of accessibility statements that are more policy documents. There may be some elements of the reality of the situation that you capture in your policy, so you've got a bit of a state. It's a bit of an artificial kind of semantic definition, but roughly that's how I'm kind of thinking about them. So when I'm talking about policy, it's really about that intent piece, but you might have bits and bobs in an accessibility statement as well. Okay, so what's your policy for? And this is an interesting one that it got me thinking, and I kind of rattled off a pile of words that I kind of think about when I think about developing a policy. And this is in no particular order. So transparency and accountability are kind of together, or sort of overlapping to a certain extent. So this is about being transparent with your customers, with your users, with your staff, whoever it happens to be, about what your intentions regarding accessibility are, potentially where you are in terms of accessibility and what you're doing about it. The accountability, that's related because if you are providing updates within your policy, so you might update your policy on a semi-regular basis as you learn more, as you find out more, as you improve things. What you are doing is you are showing that accountability. So you're upfront, you're stating this is what we're going to do, and then as time passes, you're reporting against that through your accessibility policy. As I said with the accessibility statement, there's a legal requirement within this, and there may well be a legal requirement for your policy, depending on where you are. The other one is, and this is kind of going into that corporate, what's it called? Social responsibility. And it's to show that you as an organization care about your users, your customers, your staff, again, whoever it is, and that you have and that you are working to ensure that disabled people have access to the services that you provide. You care about that. You're going through you've gone through the process of developing a policy. You're thinking about how you're going to implement that policy. That's a kind of positive part of that corporate social responsibility piece. I think internally, actually thinking about the order, I should have probably ordered these a little bit more, but that's fine. Internally, you've got two aspects which are related. So this is the rallying point and the affecting change. So a rallying point is really, it gives you something as part of the communications process around about accessibility to point people at, to say, look, this is what we've said we will do as an organization. This is the starting point. This is what we want to achieve, and we've got backing for this. We've got buy-in for this, and this is an important part of our policy landscape. So that's your kind of, it's the flag in the sand and the thing you can rally people around and move people forward. And similarly, it's a way to kind of bring about and affect change, and particularly as you start to develop your policy, as you start to act on what's in your policy, you can kind of show what change is happening and how things are improving, and that hopefully will bring about that snowball effect around about these sorts of things. But it's all tied up with that rallying point and bringing people together around about that shared idea. Sorry, the last one, and I should have probably put this one last. There's an element of this which is potentially confessional, and this is problematic. And there are a few problematic things with accessibility policies, which I'll come back to. It's very difficult for an organization to kind of step up and say, actually, we don't meet the regulations that are laid out. And this is where we don't meet those regulations. In Europe and the UK, the accessibility statement requires that any failings in accessibility are included in the accessibility statement. So public sector bodies are basically getting told, you've got to tell people where you're not accessible. We did some research a while back, and we were working with disabled people's organizations, disabled people, and asking them about the accessibility statement. And mostly this is because I didn't actually like the format of the accessibility statement, so I was kind of curious to find out what people thought of it. And one of the interesting things they thought about that confessional, both disabled people's organizations and disabled people, was it was useful to know, firstly, so that they could avoid those parts, and if there were ways around it, even better. And secondly, to know, and that avoid those parts, it's kind of like you could tell people that you support, actually this bit's not going to work for you, but the rest of it does, or you can get around this bit by doing this, that, or the other. Those can be really useful, and that was what we were told. The other bit that was interesting was a lot of people said, well, it's good to know that this bit doesn't work so that I don't have to spend time trying to work out whether it's me that's not being able to work it or it's the actual website that just doesn't work. So that confessional and outlining what's not working, it's got an important user component to it that's worth thinking about. But I appreciate that for private organizations that are selling into say, a federal market with Section 508 and requirements around about absolute accessibility and so forth, it's very difficult to kind of stand up and say, well, actually, we're not, and then expect federal organizations to still purchase your products. Very tricky one. Again, I'll come back to some of that later. So another part of the policy that's important to kind of flag up is, and important to kind of think about, and it may not be in your policy, but it's certainly around about your policy, are the kind of risks associated with accessibility and doing or not doing accessibility. And this can be quite useful, again, as part of that rallying point and that piece to encourage and effect change within your organization. So it's worth thinking about when you are thinking about a policy. Again, you might not put these in there, but it's certainly some of the thinking that you're going to do as you develop a policy. You'll start to sort of surface some of these risks, and they may be relevant to you as an organization, and it's worth paying attention to and trying to capture what that risk looks like, what the potential impact is, how you might mitigate it, all of those sorts of things that you do with a good risk register. So these are just 3 things that I thought that risks that you might explore. So those legal risks around about customer and employee, reputational risks for you as an organization, depending on the market you're working within, and the potential for loss of sales, again, depending on the market that you're working in. So those are things that you might think about as you're preparing the policy to help communicate the need for a policy and value within a policy. So who's your policy for? And again, this is an interesting one to explore in the context of your organization, because it's going to vary. It's also within the context of the policy itself. What's the scope of the policy will kind of tell a bit of a story around about who that policy is for. But these are some of the audiences that might be relevant to you. First and foremost, particularly like public sector bodies with the accessibility statement, the public, or that part of the public that happens to use your website or app. They may be concerned with your policy, but realistically, they're probably not going to be. People with disabilities and disabled people's organizations, again, are a bit more of a specific audience that you might consider. And I'll talk about it later. You might actually engage with them really in the development of your policy as well, which can be a useful and positive exercise in the whole process. Regulation monitoring bodies, they may be looking for, I certainly know in the UK, there's Government Digital Service, or part of the UK government, they monitor public sector bodies, looking at their accessibility statements and trying to find out which ones are there, which ones are not, which bits are missing, etc., etc., etc. Management, so again, as part of your communication process, as part of that developing interests, getting resources allocated to accessibility activities, management are going to be a key part of that. And throughout the management, from immediate management right up the way to the top of the organization, if you can manage that, certainly getting senior level or director level buy-in for accessibility activities and accessibility policy can be extremely beneficial for moving things forward. It's not necessarily the kind of the catch-all and the kind of the magic wand that you might imagine, but it certainly is useful if you've got director level support for the work that you're doing. And policy can be useful for the whole organization as well. Again, fitting in with the organizational sort of corporate social responsibility and organizational identity, people may well be interested around about that. The other thing that you might want to do with your the whole organization is engage people to get involved and participate in the work that needs to happen. So the policy can be used to set out how other people might be involved in your organization, and what sort of other activities might be being developed. So again, it's an element of communication tool. Finally, policy is really for you, and I'll come to who should create the policy, but if you're creating your policy, it is a vehicle to communicate and engage with management and do all that, onboarding that, encouraging people to participate in accessibility activities, securing resources, all the stuff that needs to happen in order to deliver accessibility. Your policy is there to kind of help support you in that communication activity. And again, particularly if it starts to become a signed off, formal looking piece. I remember again, when I was working in the Scottish Government, we did a lot of work looking at just straightforward resources, which I knew were already on the web. So I don't know, guidelines on how to write accessible Word documents. And I knew they were on the web, but actually what turned out to be most effective was putting it on our intranet in the intranet style with the Scottish Government flag in the top left-hand corner and making it look like a Scottish Government policy. And then all of a sudden I pointed people to it and they went, oh, it's our policy, we have to do it. And that made it easy. So those sorts of engagement, that policy can be useful in that way as well. Okay, one other group that policy might be for, might be related to, and it depends on your organization, is this diversity, equality, or equity, depending on how you phrase it, and inclusion. So, and this goes back to what I was saying about what is accessibility and what do I mean by accessibility. So DEI is concerned with that, with a much broader group of people, and much sort of wider concerns around about improving access to services, improving support, improving employment opportunities, all those things associated with diversity, inclusion, equality. Accessibility component can be seen as a part of that, a part of a broader policy framework. Whatever and however you look at it, I mean, again, my view, my personal view is, I don't think you can do diversity, equality, and inclusion if you don't do accessibility. Because effectively what you're doing when you're creating inaccessible products is you're creating absolute barriers for a group of people who should be able to participate independently, and they can't because you've done these things that just would preclude that. So I see that without accessibility, which is a very known quantity and something that we can't deliver on, DEI kind of fails. So that's why I think if you've got DEI and you've got a DEI unit or organized department or whatever, engagement with them is probably going to be a key part of whatever you do with the policy. I've put an example at the bottom there, which was better than my wittering. It's hard to have a diverse workforce if some of them can't enter the building or are unable to use the digital work environment. And that's where you kind of have your accessibility, and then you start thinking about, well, yeah, at the same time, but on top of that, you're thinking about diversity, equality, and inclusion. Okay, how should you go about creating your policy? This is a bit of a whistle stop because there's probably a load of stuff that you can do within this, and some of these hide a lot of work. I think the first one's really to start thinking about what's the scope of your policy. How wide are you throwing the net? And that's both in terms of the kind of what digital assets it's going to cover, but also in terms of what's part of the organization it's going to cover. Ideally, you'd want to cover the whole organization, but that can be really difficult because you may not have any power to affect change in some parts of your organization. So you may have a policy which is local in terms of how you're going to deal with accessibility within your area. And it may be that other parts of the organization pick that up, but at least that's actually starting that thinking. The other thing to think about within the policy is websites. What websites is it covering? What apps is it covering? And are they the internal ones? Are they the external ones? Are they both? I think we are increasingly required to work on web-based and digital products as part of our working life. And we often forget in our drive for accessibility that actually it applies to those internal things as well. And if we don't do a good job there, then actually what we're doing is we're making it harder for disabled people to enter the workforce and take up independent employment opportunities. So that's an important part to consider. I think the other one within all of those is the distinction between digital and web. So web is the way we think about it, and I'll probably get picked up for doing this wrong. Web's basically anything that's getting delivered through a browser. It's the web sort of framework, the HTML, CSS, JavaScript delivered through a browser. You're using a web app, whatever it happens to be. Digital is a little bit more broad, so it's things like your conferencing software, which is much more of an application on your desktop, your sort of your chat software, which again might be an application, your email client, whatever it happens to be. It's a digital interface that still needs to be accessible because it's part of that whole environment that, particularly around about employment, where someone is working in. So that's again something you might want to think about, and that kind of changes things like what standards or regulations apply and so forth. The other one to think about, and this is one of the tough ones, and I've kind of been involved with like public sector in Scotland and the broader UK for a while, and this is one which always catches people, and it's actually purchased systems. So you can have fantastic internal accessibility policies, fantastically trained people, you're developing fully accessible products, but as soon as you go out and try and purchase something, you are limited in what options are available. If you basically say we want only accessible systems to be purchased. Now, again, I'll come to this later because this is something where it's kind of like, how do we affect change using a policy and how does the policy apply? But it's something to also think about because in many respects, if you're running an organization and it's an enterprise level organization, you may not have the option to pick and choose and wait for a fully accessible product for whatever it is you're trying to deliver. So there's an element of what do you do in those circumstances and how do you get over that? That's kind of one of the challenges around about that. So once you've kind of started having a think about the scope and so forth, and sorry, these aren't numbered because you don't have to do these in order, but these are sorts of things you have to have a think about. You might want to have a think about what standards or regulations apply to you or are useful to pick up. Obviously, there's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and those underpin a lot of the regulations around the globe. So that's obviously something that you would be putting in there. Certainly the UK and EU public sector regulations, if you follow the trail around about harmonized standards, you'll end up in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. There's a lot more around about that, but that's kind of one of the things that most people will test against and reference and so forth. So have a think about that. Again, if you're thinking about digital, what happens there, that's a little bit more tricky, but there are still standards around about there that are worth considering when you're pulling together your policy. Coming back to the accountability sort of side of things and what your policy's for, you kind of want to think about some realistic milestones and plan those in. And you may want to kind of communicate what you're planning on doing. It may be more difficult or tricky to do that, but certainly start thinking about what are the milestones that you've got, what can you realistically achieve in the time scale that you've got with the resources that you have. All of those sorts of questions are important to start thinking about at that point. You're not necessarily going to have a lovely, perfect Gantt chart with absolute perfect swim lanes and lines of development activity and improvement, but you may have something that you might want to kind of consider as key milestones and worth doing. This is useful again for rallying people around and encouraging activity and celebrating activity when you achieve one of those milestones. So it's a really useful thing to do and covers a lot of the ticks about why you create a policy. I think the other one, and related to that, is how are you going to monitor and review your progress? If you don't do that, how do you know anything you do is making a difference? How do you know you are improving? So you need to work out within that, how are you going to do the monitoring? What are you going to monitor? What are you going to track? And what does good look like when you're within there? And again, I'll talk about that in a little bit. The last one within a policy, and this is, I mean, it's relevant for internal and external policies. It's include ways for people to get in touch. Because if you're setting out your policy and you're saying that this is what we're going to do, this is what we've done, then providing people with a way to get in contact with you and go, actually, it's not working, or thank you very much, or have you considered this? That's actually what you're looking to achieve there. You're looking to be able to provide a way for people to get in touch with you and communicate good and bad with what's going on with your policy, and that's an important part of it. So what roughly should you include in your policy? Excuse me a second. Now again, there's no hard and fast on this one, but these are probably, I was looking at this and I've got two slides. I've got what should you include and what could you include. These are probably the ones that I would be looking to definitely include if I can. So it's that assertion of broad goals. What is it you're trying to do? We are trying to make all our internal products more accessible. We're trying to do this. We're trying to meet WCAG 2.2 or whatever it is we're trying to do. That's your broad assertion, and that high level kind of sense of this is the direction that we want to go in. You want to probably include some of the scope. I remember somebody from the research saying it's useful to know what the policy or statement relates to, and then if I have got a concern or a complaint about something, I know that it's covered by this, and if it's not mentioned they are not covered by this, then that's fine. It's just useful to know. So having that scope is very clear and useful. I would argue that having an outline of your proposed plan is a very useful thing to put in your policy. Again, it kind of supports that sense of accountability to whoever it is your audience is, whoever your customers are, whatever. It encourages support and moving things forward and getting additional resources. So having that outline and proposed plan, definitely a plus, I feel. I think the other one that related to that is this updates and progress. So showing that there is change happening. I don't think anybody expects everything to happen overnight, but showing that you are making changes, that this is where you started and these are all the things that you've done and this is all how it's all improved. That tells a good story, and it also encourages people that that change is happening, and that particularly and this is an interesting one, particularly if it's happening as a result of feedback from customers, staff, whoever, then that can be a good encouragement for those people as well, to show actually what we're doing matters, what we say matters, they will pay attention to it. Contact details, as I said, allow people to get in touch, allow people to praise you for your effective changes and the positive steps that you're taking, or to point out where you've still got work to do. And finally, I would say a date of when this was last updated. And again, this is back to the accountability. If you don't put that in, people might look at this and go, well, is this like 10 years old and they've just ignored it since then? So it gives a sense of progress and movement, and that can be quite useful. So other things that you could put in your policy, and some of these, depending on where you are, depending on the regulations, may be required. So I'm not saying these are not to be included or anything like that. Look at your local legislation if there is a part to that. But you might want to be putting in relevant standards or legislation. Again, coming back to the research, there was a couple of people who said, I don't care what the standard is, I just want it to work for me. That's fine, but some people do care about the standards, so we need to put that in there. Need to make sure it's not too technical, so it's not overwhelming people unnecessarily, but it may be a relevant part to include. Another part, and again, I spoke briefly about this, just outlining existing problem areas and how to avoid them. This can be something that's really useful for people who are using the site. And if they know that the application form isn't, this particular application form isn't going to work for them, and that's the one that where they need to phone in or whatever it happens to be, then they know that up front. They're not going to get frustrated. It's very clear. You've provided an alternative pathway. That can be useful. Ideally, have it so that the form does work and they don't have to do that, but you'll get to that one eventually. Details of your monitoring and reviewing process, that might be quite useful to kind of outline what it is you're tracking and how you're sort of going about that improvement and what you're doing for that. And similarly, looking at the outcomes of your monitoring and review process. And this is related to that sense of progress and the updates that you're doing. You can show the number of issues that you've identified, number of failing pages, whatever it happens to be, and we'll come to that in a bit. So that might be some of the things that you could include in your policy. There may be others that I've forgotten. So coming back to what I said about engagement with disabled people's organizations and staff, you might want to test your policy, just as you might run usability testing on your website. You might want to do some testing on your policy. This can be useful for a number of things, a number of reasons. First off, it is a really good opportunity to engage with other parts of your organization, particularly if there's an element within that policy which is about the internal user experience and the internal accessibility. This gives you a chance to kind of get out there, let people know that it's going on, let people know that you're thinking about it, get people's input into the whole process, and that can be quite useful in understanding whether the policy is doing what it needs to do. The usual things for doing usability testing and user research: have you missed something? Is there something inherent within there that you've just not thought about, or it's a blind spot, or it's not something that you're aware of in the organization? And that can be quite useful in order to, or if you're testing your policy, it can be quite useful to try and find that. And finally, I mean, the big one is, does your policy make sense to the intended audience? This was, again, something we kind of did a fair bit of work on. It was trying to understand whether the way that we had to write the content and the accessibility statements made sense to disabled people who were flagged as one of the key audiences for this document. There were bits that did and there were bits that didn't. So it was a good opportunity to kind of find out more about that. But I would suggest try and test your policy as much as possible, which can always be useful. Right. Who creates and maintains it? So given that you're in the room here, so to speak, virtually, it's probably you. But there's going to be other key contributors and other stakeholders that you need to either work together with or seek input from. Because without them, and again, good reasons, it starts communicating that this is something that you're doing. It engages them from an early start and gets their input into what things like the scope are going to be, what's realistic in terms of milestones, and an awareness that this is something that's coming down the line. So some groups that you might include are whoever your technical team is, or technical department, or technical part of the organization. I mean, they're obviously a key one, particularly if you're developing your own products and websites and apps and whatever, since they're the ones that are probably going to be finding a lot of the issues. They're certainly the ones that are probably going to be fixing most of the issues. But engaging with technical team is going to be a key part to this, because they're going to be doing a lot of the work. Your broader product team. Now, within product team, I'd probably put people like business analysts, user researchers, service designers, all the content designers, all the sort of people that are non-technical within a product team, and product owners, are a big ally on these sorts of things as well. So it's convincing them or communicating to them what the goal is, what their role is potentially within this, what you're looking to achieve, and trying to understand what they're saying in terms of achievable milestones and all that sort of stuff. So again, they may be a key contributor. Procurement, somebody else that might get involved. And again, the reason they're going to be involved is because you might be buying lots of systems. I know that we engage quite a lot with procurement teams in various different organizations to try and work out how do we increase the chances of purchasing an accessible product when we go out to buy digital products and services. And it's a tricky one. And that's probably a talk all in itself, but procurement might be an important part within your policy to work with, to understand that key question of what is it you can do to really increase your chances of purchasing something accessible, or increasing your chances of, even if you can't purchase something accessible, purchasing something with an organization who is very keen on developing their own product, and that's a good sort of step back from that. HR, so your human resources, whatever they happen to be called nowadays, may also be an important ally within this and an important contributor, particularly again if you're looking at internal systems, internal processes around about things like employment onboarding and employment services. HR may be a kind of key part within there. And as we discussed earlier, diversity, equality or equity and inclusion if you've got a team that's looking at that, they may well be a key contributor, or you may be contributing to kind of that broader inclusion framework, whatever they're doing. One of the interesting ones, and again, I'll come to this later, but whoever it is you've got as key contributors, whether it's you or someone else, try and make it part of their job description and something that is part of their annual review, because then it's kind of integrated and woven into what they're doing, and it really kind of drives that forward. It kind of reinforces it with their manager that this is part of their job and that this is something that's going to kind of come up again, and this is something they're going to spend time on. So it's a kind of key part and really important piece, and worth thinking about how do you recognize that contribution to both developing the policy but also delivering on the policy. Okay, kind of flipping that over a wee bit, and it's who's responsible for delivering on the policy. And again, this is going to be massively dependent on your scope, on your organization, on what you've agreed to do, but similar sorts of folks: technical, design, product, process change, depending on what your organization's like and how they approach process and how they approach change management. You might find that you've got a change team, and they can be quite useful when you're thinking about, again, particularly internal policies and processes and how to make them more accessible. Communications and marketing, again, depending on who's managing your websites, who's procuring new websites and putting them up and managing the content, they can be a really important ally as well. And again, bang the drum on procurement, they may well be an important contributor to delivering on the policy. Obviously, if they are going to be a contributor to delivering to it and responsible for delivering to it, they probably need to be involved in testing and developing your policy to a certain extent, or at least have visibility of the milestones and scope that you're looking at. So there's a kind of flip around about this. These are people that you're probably looking at, and then they're then going to go and do the work. So you need to get them on side. The other thing within this is it kind of starts to identify areas where you might want to target training and support and particular resources or tools that might help when they are trying to deliver against the policy. So this is kind of a good way to start thinking about that sort of stuff as well. Okay, so measuring progress. So I kind of mentioned that as part of the policy, it's really important to understand what progress you're making and how you're going to measure that. There's a second part to this, which is impact, which I'll come to after this. I think when you're thinking about progress and metrics and all that sort of stuff, it's kind of like you're going to have to work out where you are now. So regardless of what metrics you choose, you've got to try and baseline them. If you've not got a decent baseline, I mean, I'm sure you all know this stuff. No baseline, how do you know you've done anything when you start measuring it in a year's time? So that's you want to be clear on what your metrics are. And this, I'll talk through some possible metrics, and then I'll talk through some of the challenges with them. But it's really trying to pick out your metrics so that you are genuinely measuring progress and, to as much as possible, demonstrating impact. And those are kind of woven together and very difficult to unpick and get right. The other thing that you can do when you've got some metrics is you can communicate success, or you can communicate progress, and you can do that far and wide. You can do that throughout your organization, again, building out awareness and knowledge of what you're trying to do. You can do it externally through your accessibility policy that's published on your website, and then people know that you're actually serious about what you're trying to do. So those are the sorts of things you want to think about when you're thinking about measuring progress. Sharon, you have preempted me. Some possible metrics. And yes, impact is hard,
wonderful.
So I'll come easy.
Great, thank you.
Pleasure. So I'm going to go through these, but bear in mind, I'm going to also go through a slide which talks about the problems with metrics. And that's something that you kind of need to think about quite a lot. And then, yes, it's how do you connect it with impact? And again, that's probably what you're going to spend some time thinking about when you're looking at this. So these are just some possible ones. I'm sure you'll think of others. I'm sure other people have thought of others, and that's fine. You could, for a specified set of digital products, go, right, the number of WCAG success criteria passes or fails. Relatively straightforward, may not cover everything, whatever, but it gives you something. And it's within that you might want to kind of because you've got a specified set of digital products, you've got a consistency around about your metrics. So year on year or quarter on quarter, whatever you're measuring, you've got a sense of, well, actually we are actually showing progress and we are measuring relatively the same thing each time. Don't know. You could be looking at within, again, a set digital product or website, the number of pages with conformance failures. So you take a step back from the WCAG success criteria and you just go, actually, we've got 400 pages, 5,000 pages, 20,000 pages, whatever it happens to be, that have conformance failures. And then a year later, you've got 200, whatever it happens to be. So again, that might be something that worked. Total time required to fix known issues. This one is kind of, that pulls it back to the technical and potentially the content designers and writers. And that can be quite an interesting one because that starts to capture some of the complexity of difficult problems. So you might have 20,000 issues on your site, but in actual fact, 19,998 of them are an absolute breeze to fix, and 2 of them are a little bit harder. Or you might have 10 issues and they are absolutely fundamentally nightmarish to fix and will take months and months and months. So if you're looking at the total time to fix known issues, and it's obviously estimated total time, then that might be a good way to do it. The other one, and so those sort of previous issues, certainly the first 2 talk about, are related to the standards. You might take a step further and look at some qualitative experiential metrics. Now the challenge that you got with this is it's trying to baseline in a way that you can do it each year or each quarter or each cycle where you're doing your monitoring. So you would then maybe have to specify the tasks that you're doing, specify the number of people that you're working with, potentially even specify the disabilities. And again, there's a problem with that, which I'll come to in a second. Some other possible metrics, and these starting to become more and more problematic as we go through them. Number of employees that you have with disabilities or with disclosed disabilities. That might be something particularly that HR want to measure to show that they are becoming a more inclusive organisation. And it may be related to the accessibility of your workplace or your employment process. So that might be relevant. Number of complaints related to accessibility. Again, that's an interesting one, which you might think would be great, but it has a problem with it. And then probably more relevant in the US, although there are cases in the UK and Europe as well. How much are you paying in legal fees if you've got an inaccessible set of products? That might be something where you go, well, actually, we want to bring that one down. Obviously, well, I don't want to get into talking about the challenge of lawsuits associated with accessibility. So I'll just leave that one there. Okay, so I've said a few times that there are problems with metrics. This is the kind of slide where I start to kind of unpick everything, all that. One of the top problems with metrics is it might suggest that there isn't a problem. And that's a tricky one. So you might see that there aren't, well, actually, a bad one, which I'll come to, but it can kind of work against you, is you might find we have no disabled employees. And management go, well, let it go, no problem. I mean, obviously, that's a bad thing. But when you're choosing your metrics, think about, well, what's really going to change here and how is it going to change and what are we going to show? So that can be a tricky challenge because there are things that you definitely want to measure, but if it doesn't show a problem, what does that then do for your policy? What does it mean for the work that you're doing? Thinking about that employee situation, that's a tricky one as well. Not everyone who's an employee will disclose a disability. And also there are plenty of hidden disabilities. They may not want to talk about the disability, so it may not be part of their employment. So that makes it very hard to use that as a metric for accessibility, even if you can say that it is a metric for accessibility. So that's kind of one thing to think around about that. In terms of providing feedback and capturing complaints associated with accessibility. This is one that I've experienced and spoken with a number of people about. Disabled people can be disinclined to provide feedback. And one of the reasons I heard, which it made me feel sad, quite frankly, was it doesn't matter if I provide feedback, nothing's going to change. And that's a difficult psychology to get over because you can't change that person's experience and what they went through and the fact that they've realized they have complained and nothing happens. And that's one of the problems. And that's actually one of the reasons why you want to show what is changing. And ideally, if it is changing as a result of feedback, it's showing that it changed as a result of feedback. Our users said this, our customers said this, our employees said this, and we did this, and we made a change, and it was a good thing. So please tell us more about the things that need to change. That's an interesting one because if you do start to do that and you are measuring that as a metric, you might find that as you show that you are responding to feedback, it can increase and you get more feedback. And as Jen puts in the chat there, yeah, feedback can be weaponized. It's a tricky one. But again, it's think through the issues rather than just kind of go, it's worth kind of thinking about all these ones.
Can you explain a little bit about feedback becomes weaponized? I don't quite get that.
So it can be used, and maybe this is something that Jen can kind of comment on as well, but it can be used to basically try to affect change or attack certain things that are just not liked. So it's maybe not necessarily just about accessibility. Sorry, Jen, I'm probably not explaining this very well, and you're probably going to be way better than me at it, if you're willing to explain.
Sure, I was starting to type in the chat. What I have found as a person with disabilities, when I give feedback, that feedback then becomes maybe it's how I phrase it. I'm still working on it, and I couch it in a million different ways. But sometimes that feedback is seen as registered as complaints or allegations, and it's not that. It's saying something, for example, I have approved accommodations. They aren't being met on this project. I need help. The person that I'm supposed to go to is busy and doesn't help for a couple of weeks, and then a couple of weeks turns into 6 weeks. And by that time, my medical condition is so triggered, I'm not capable of advocating for myself. And now I have memorandum of warning in my personnel file for delivering delivering reports with not good faith. And it's like, it was totally good faith. Like, it was saying, we need to have a process whereby an employee who has accommodations has some sort of a resolution in a prompt fashion so that their health doesn't suffer. An employee with a disability should not have to limp along and potentially risk an ER visit or worse because the accommodation is not being met. Does that make sense?
That makes sense to me. Sharon, does that make sense to you?
Are you still there?
Oh,
Sharon?
sorry, I was talking away. Yes, that was actually very
perfect.
helpful. Thank you.
Awesome.
I didn't understand which direction the weapon was pointed until you explained that to me. So thanks.
Lots of different.
Welcome.
Thank you, Jen. Thanks, Sharon. So a couple of other issues. A lot of the data that you might capture associated with these metrics may have data protection or privacy issues. So again, you may need to think through those. And the last one related to that qualitative experiential metrics, if you are focusing on specified disabilities because you kind of need to contain the set in order to get repeatability, you may be leaving out other people and other disabilities. And that then means, well, one, you're not representing those disabilities, but you may also be missing issues within what you're measuring. So measurement and metrics are really important, but they're really challenging, and it's really difficult to ensure that you've kind of got the right ones and that you're measuring something that makes sense. Related to that, and one of the things that you want to do with your metrics is demonstrate that whatever it is you're doing matters. And how do you know that it matters? And as I joke there, this is not an existential question. The challenge is to join the dots between any intervention or remediation and an outcome, ideally a positive outcome, a change related to your policy. And that can be really, really tricky. For some issues like code, for example, code changes are relatively straightforward. You make a change in code because of a compliance failure, that compliance failure goes away. That's a relatively straightforward line to draw. But if you're starting to look at the qualitative experience, then it's harder. How do you know that that qualitative experience has been fixed specifically by a change in the code? If you're looking at something like disabled employees, and again, this is something I've seen with HR departments, how do you know any of the changes that you're making is having an increase? It's what is causing a change in the number of disabled employees. Now, you could kind of say, well, actually, our employment process is inaccessible. It has, I don't know, you have to take a photo of yourself and submit it through an inaccessible form, which makes it impossible for, say, a JAWS user to kind of go through that process. If you fix that and you don't see an increase in disabled employees, was that fix worth it? Did it have an impact? That's kind of the challenge. If you don't fix it and you see an increase in disabled employees, what did that mean? So that's where the line becomes much, much harder to determine. But it is a really important one. And the importance is around about that organizational buy-in. If you can demonstrate the impact of the work that you are doing, it becomes increasingly easier to ensure that the organization gets behind what you are doing. And that's the big challenge with all of these sorts of things. And going back to briefly that sense, one of the problems with the metrics that they might suggest there isn't a problem. It's the same with impact. It might not be clear what the impact of any intervention or work or revenue spend or whatever it is was. And actually, that's one of the things it's worth spending a fair amount of time thinking about. Okay, so the last bit I want to talk about is you've got a policy. So what? The best policy in the world is worth nothing if you don't actually walk the talk. And that's very much around about what the policy is saying you're doing, what your goals and aims and the intent that you have. How are you delivering on that? The example that Sharon gave when we were chatting before was very much associated with this. It's like you have an organizational policy and yet you deliver webinars with no captions, or you send out untagged PDFs that are impossible to process. How do you kind of stand up with those and ensure that those aren't kind of the common approach to it when you have got an accessibility policy that says your intent is to ensure that disabled people are not disadvantaged or excluded? That's what you're going to try and do. So I overburdened myself with alliteration and came up with communication, carrots, and consequences. And I'm just going to talk through those briefly. Sorry, something's just popped up on my screen. So communication. I think this is, and I've touched on this in a few points. Have a plan for telling people about your policy, because the more they know about it, and the more you communicate about it, the more they might think, well, hang on a second, there's something I can do about this. And that's particularly when you outline why it matters. And that can be a kind of strong sort of a strong way of encouraging people to get involved. The other thing you can kind of do is give examples of how people can help deliver against that policy within their area. One of the things I tried to do in the Scottish Government was, once I recognised that a lot of the work that we did was about producing documents, I worked hard to teach people how to use their document editor. And that was kind of the big driver for that. And we set up kind of local hubs to try and get people to do that and to encourage others to learn about it and so forth. So it was like, what was the example that kind of was driving the policy policy intent that we had? Carrots. How do you kind of encourage people to keep doing this, to do more, to participate, to improve? And I mean, part of this is about, I think, celebrating people's roles and what they do, and the change that they've brought. And again, there are different ways to do that. Champions programs, there's a lot of talk about those. I think they can be extremely valuable, as long as you know that the champion program is actually kind of bringing about change. What's it actually doing? Goes back to your metrics and your impact and so forth. But it can be quite useful, particularly if you've got a big organization and a small accessibility team. Development opportunities can be quite useful. So have you got pathways for people who become more and more interested in accessibility that give them actual physical rewards and value for actually developing their skills and improving? Is that something that your organization can do? Is it big enough it can do? Recognition in annual reviews. So again, going back to put this in people's job descriptions, and recognize this as wins in annual reviews if you are delivering against the accessibility policy. That can be really good. More broadly, celebrating wins. I think this is a big one. If you have achieved something amazing, if you have done something that's really brought about change, or if you've got some really good feedback, celebrate it. Make it a big thing. Let people know about it. And I think related to that is talking about improvements and progress. And again, kind of mentioned in the policy, one of the things that I think is important is to ensure that you say, well, we had this feedback, or we found this thing and we made this improvement, and being open about the progress that you're making as much as you can. And I appreciate the challenge within that for certain types of organizations. The consequences. This is the hardest one, I think. And it's really difficult. I mean, and you kind of think, and I mean, I remember years and years ago when I wasn't in the public sector, I hadn't been in the public sector, I hadn't worked with procurement, I hadn't done kind of mass big projects and all of those sorts of things. And it's very easy to go, well, don't buy inaccessible products. If you buy a product that someone says it's accessible and it's not, don't pay them. All of these possibly idealistic or naive, depending on how generous you're being, views. And it's very difficult to do that. It's very difficult to hold suppliers to account. It's very difficult to hold teams to account who are not delivering on these things, because we want to kind of try, we're trying to get develop people to encourage improvement, to get people to kind of self-start on a lot of this sort of stuff. So it's very hard to kind of outline what the consequences are. I'm much more of a carrot person than a consequences person. One that you can potentially do, but it is difficult, is that if you are procuring, and procurement is a kind of a common theme in the challenging space. If you're procuring, then try and select more accessible products, and more than just select more accessible products, communicate that you are doing that, because that's kind of then sending a message. It's using that buying power to change the market, and that can be effective. I mean, I've certainly seen over the last few years working in public sector a bit of a change in how suppliers talk about accessibility, because there's been much more noise about it in the UK public sector. Can't speak to other public sectors, but certainly I've seen that in the UK public sector. Still not perfect, but there is more there that's about that. The last one's really kind of that if you've got the internal knowledge, you've got the capacity, you've got the way to do this, it's calling out supplier compliance failures, and I think importantly working with them to improve it. One of the things that I was very keen on was working with suppliers to help them improve their products so that we could have an accessible product. The sell to them that I always tried to promote was, actually what you're doing is you're making your product better if you can do these things. You're doing it for us, but hopefully other customers will benefit from this. You will benefit hopefully by having more sales. It was trying to work with them, and a good supplier was one that I could work with, in my view, to improve accessibility. Cool. So last thing I think that I'm just going to say is, because I didn't want to end on the consequences, because that seems quite a downer. Stay positive about this. We know that accessibility is never really done. I think if we can make tomorrow slightly better than today, then we're going in the right direction. And Merrill Evans and that sense of progress over perfection. I know that there are people that think, no, we just should be there. But I think realistically, we still need to kind of continue to progress. We need to kind of keep looking at it and going, actually, we can get a wee bit better. We're not going to get perfect, but we can get a wee bit better. That's a big plus from my perspective. So just to wrap up and try and sort of pull out some bullet points about it. I think do the groundwork, find out who the stakeholders are, find out what your metrics are going to be, think about what the scope is, all of that sort of stuff. Create a policy that's suited to your organization and suited to that scope. There's no point in kind of just picking up an off-the-shelf thing. You can get some of that. There are some things that you can do, but think about your organization and what you're trying to achieve and what you think is realistic, and have a policy that's suited to that. Use that policy, promote it internally, promote the intent, engage with the audiences, outline what you're trying to do, and try and get people to kind of come in behind you and help move it forward. Measure what you can so that you can highlight the impact. And those spoke about them quite a bit. Measurement theory and all that. Well, actually, measurement theory is a bit more math. Measures and setting up measures and metrics is a really challenging space. There's people with more knowledge about that can talk about that than me, but it is one of the difficult ones because ultimately it's about demonstrating that the investment and the resources and the time and all of that is actually having an impact, and it is a positive impact, and that's an important one to try and think through. Celebrate the success massively, because if you celebrate the success, you're promoting that your intent and your engagement and the work that you're doing is making a difference, because there are these successes that are really, really important, and that is extremely valuable. Slight tangential story, which it was one of my favorite stories. There was a big bit of policy work or a big product that we worked on for, I can't remember the agency in Scotland, but they did grants for young adults, disabled young adults, to help them live independently. And I remember there was one that came through, which was a young lad who had gone through the whole application process because he wanted a dog. And we were all looking at it and going, well, are we going to buy him a dog? And he had set out a case for why that dog was important to him. And what was fantastic was we had designed this whole service so that he was able to do it independently. He was able to do it himself and get to the point where he could actually express his desire, his need, what he was looking for and how it would help him. And at the end of it, we gave him a grant and he went off and bought a dog, or the agency gave him a grant and he went off and bought a dog. And I was absolutely over the moon about this and told loads of people about it. And I was very happy, because the work that we did to make that process work for him made his life better by buying him a dog, which was great. And there was a puppy involved. What's not to love? And finally, keep at it. This is hard work. We all kind of are faced with the cliff and the uphill struggle and so forth. But that progress over perfection and making tomorrow slightly better than today, it's all worth it and worth keeping going. There's a couple of resources on the WAY website. There's one which is developing organizational policies and web accessibility. It kind of goes through bits and bobs of what we've done. There's a bit more in this talk. There's another section which is planning and managing accessibility, and there's a big piece on plan, which again talks about some of these things. There's a lot more to that planning and managing, so feel free to have a look at those. They can be quite useful. You might be able to pick up some things there that are useful. And that is me. Does anybody have any questions? I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I think I've looked at that enough, if I can find the button.
I know we said we were going to use the Q&A function, but if it's easier for y'all and you'll like to ask questions out loud, you can use the raise your hand function and we'll call on you. Whatever works best.
I put it in the chat, but I just wanted to say that planning and managing guide that you referenced, Kevin. I send that to people all the time who are starting to build programs, and it's high level and it's not specific. You have to customize it to whatever your situation is, but it is excellent in terms of covering the bases, giving you the general ideas of what are the components that you need to think about and plan for. I just think that is an excellent resource. So I wanted to just add that.
Cool. Thank you. David.
I've got a long question because I noted there might have been some time for a long question.
That's fine.
So sorry in advance. Yeah, so I'm in an organization and my team, we made an accessibility strategy. I think we didn't call it a policy because we're in government and policy is like a very specific thing in government.
Oh, it is.
And it was like, don't touch it with a 10-foot pole sort of thing. We made a strategy and it's been pretty darn successful. So I had hopes of like using this to springboard to a strategy for sort of the broader organization on accessibility. But yeah, looking for advice for like that. You talked a bit about at the beginning of like the scope piece of like, what will this policy be scoped for? Who's it for? Any advice on like increasing that scope once there's like success in a smaller space?
Yeah, good question and good approach, actually, I think. And it highlights one of the values of kind of taking that contained scope. And I think what you can do with that, or certainly what I would try and think about doing in that case, is actually using what you've done as a case study to then communicate more broadly, right? This is what we've done. This is what was achieved by what we did, and this is what we think could happen if we kind of take that much more further. And that's, I think, particularly in the public sector, who are very, very risk averse and very, very resource sort of limited. If you can show, well, actually, we did this and there wasn't much in the way of risk associated with it, and there was no kind of massive backlash, and it didn't cost us an arm and a leg, then you can kind of sell that a little bit more. And I think that's, having it as a case study almost is, I think, one of the big advantages that you've got of where you are and what you've done. And I mean, public sector in the UK, you've always got, you can fall back on the regulation and just go, well, as almost a starter for 10 and saying, we need to do this, and here's how. And that can be a big kind of driver as well. I mean, certainly public sector, certainly senior public sector employees and civil servants are all too often faced with a situation where they are given a problem and no solution. What you're doing is you're giving them a problem with a solution, and that's a big win.
Do we have any more questions? Okay, just want to mention we had a little in the chat there. Oh, Kevin, you saw it. The Jenny saying thank you for the information. That's gonna help her. So I'm really glad that this
I
is able
hope
to
so,
help
yeah.
somebody so much. If we don't have any more questions, we do ask that you guys stick around for just a minute here. On the left here, we have a link to our session survey. Please, if you don't mind, please either scan the QR code, or you can go to bit.ly/July 20 BADA and fill out our survey. It should only take a few minutes. And if you'd like to contribute to our programs, you can also scan that QR code on the right there, or visit nobility.org/donate. I'd also like to mention that registration for our Accessibility Internet Rally is currently open, and we're looking for teams, individual developers, nonprofit organizations that would like their website rebuilt, and we're looking for sponsors. So we have lots of different opportunities available. So if you'd like to learn more about AIR, please visit nobility.org/AIR.
Anna, I'd just add to that's really good information about AIR, but if any of you have not participated or aren't familiar with it, it's we're 25 years old this year. It's the 25th year that we've held this accessible web design contest, and really what it is an active learning. So teams of web developers or digital professionals get together and they take some trainings from accessibility experts. So the training itself is really valuable. But then for the next 8 weeks after the training and the matchup, they work on a very simple website for a nonprofit organization. And then we have a judging and we give prizes. And it's really a fun way to engage with accessibility. So if you have teams of developers or designers in your organization who need to learn about accessibility. And, you know, a lot of times it can feel like, oh, I have to do this. I have to take this training because it's a requirement, it's a mandate. But this puts accessibility in the context of fun, friendly, competitive, creative engagement. You help another nonprofit organization that's struggling to be on the web. So it's a lot of fun, and there's a lot of information on our website. If you just go to nobility.org, the first big banner you see is it's airtime, and we're going to celebrate 25 years this year. So we're pretty excited. Hope that some of you might find it useful to participate or have some teams participate. Okay, I'll hush now.
No, thank you so much, Sharon. That was really good. Yeah, it is our 25th year and we're having a big birthday celebration. So you want to be a part of it this year. Okay, I think that concludes our July edition of Be a Digital Ally. Thank you so much again to Kevin for coming in and talking. That was really awesome. And I think there's a lot of really useful information, a lot of great insider info. So just so you guys know, this recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel once we have captioning fixed and ready. So you have that to look forward to if you'd like to reference it. And the slide deck has been dropped in the chat a couple times. So if you need that, feel free to save that. Thank you again, everybody, to coming, and thank you again to Kevin. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you,
You
everyone.
were awesome.
Thank you, Sharon. Take care.
Thank you.